scheduled for publication. She lectures nationally and internationally on topics including evolution, artificial intelligence, consciousness, culture, and religion. Illya is also founder of the Omega Center, a 501c3 nonprofit offering a vision of wholeness for our troubled times. The divisive fragmentation of our age reflects a deep yearning for a new holistic understanding to heal our divisions, deepen our compassion, and ignite the human spirit toward greater unity and flourishing. The Teilhardian concept of Omega, upon which the Center's vision and work is based, is understood not as a destination, but as a deepening toward a more unified future. Omega is the revelation of God as the fullness of love, as a dynamic center of love at the heart of all creation. This afternoon, she will explore the relationship between mysticism and consciousness, a relationship that is at the heart of Teilhard de Chardin's vision. The title of her talk is For Love of Matter, Mysticism and the Limits of Panpsychism. Please join me in welcoming Ilia Delio.
Thank you, Greg. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, good. Well, first of all, it's good to be with you on this very engaging topic. Second, I'm really glad I'm a theologian, quite honestly. I deeply appreciate the philosophical perspectives, but they really get fine-tuned and drilled down to, very detailed things. Here's the thing. I have been grappling with this question of matter and consciousness for some time. Back when I was at Georgetown, Father John Hoy and I would spend hours on just the question, what is matter? And so as I listened to our speakers last night and this morning, as I continue to engage these questions, I do think we can understand this question of consciousness in relation to matter by science and philosophy alone. I do think we need the third dimension of religion. It has been alluded to in the previous talks, but my hope is to bring it into a more explicit discussion this afternoon. I want to begin in a sense where I began on the question of consciousness and matter, and that is, in a sense, the resurgence of panpsychism in the 20th century with the findings of quantum physics. So let me just begin with the very simple, it's not so simple really, but the finding at the early 20th century that what we call matter is really much more pluralistic, more inherently mysterious than we might have believed. Thanks to de Broglie and Max Planck and other physicists, we began to realize through various experiments, especially the double slit experiment, that a particle does not exist objectively as a particle, but always in this rather indeterminate state of wave-particle interference. And so scientists began to realize that we can't say exactly what something is apart from the act of observation. And so I think, we began to appreciate ever more the role of the observer in the determination of what is observed. So this idea that there's no objective reality, in a sense, began to emerge. The physicist James Jean wrote in 1950, he said, "Mind no longer appears as an accident intruder into the realm of matter." He said, "Mind may be the creator and governor of the realm of matter. The quantum phenomenon," he wrote, "makes it possible to propose that the background of the universe is mind-like." Now, again, we have been talking, in a sense, along these lines, but this was rather, I think, startling. The background, certainly to scientists, right? The background of the universe is mind-like. And yet, Max Planck, the great physicist, wrote, "I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness." That, in a sense, has been our dilemma, all along. What does that mean? We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything we regard as existing, postulates consciousness. And that's really inherent to our, challenge in this discussion of matter and mind. Erwin Schrödinger said the same thing. Consciousness cannot be accounted for in physical terms. Consciousness is absolutely fundamental, and it cannot be accounted for in terms of anything else. So at least, from the point of Planck and Schrödinger, what they're saying is there's a primacy of consciousness. And, I think part of what I, continue to grapple with is what is consciousness? We've been using that language here, but we have never really defined, well, what is it? What is it that we're talking about? Not that I'm going to give you any answer here, but I'm going to try to at least come a little bit closer. So, at least from the early physicists, they're saying, the 20th century physicists, in the beginning was consciousness, we can say, right? In a sense, everything begins with consciousness. So, we ask the question, well, what is consciousness? Niels Bohr just speculated that consciousness may be the wave side of the wave-particle duality. That in some way consciousness involves that relationship or that flow of information, so to speak. Michio Kaku, the Japanese physicist, says that consciousness is a type of feedback loops. He says a type of communication that involves the flow of information. Well, that's kind of interesting in itself as a working hypothesis of what consciousness may be. A type of flow of information that involves relationality. Is consciousness the same as mind? We have been using that language almost interchangeably here. But it seems that if we, again, take this notion of consciousness as the flow of information and relationality, which, as I think Phil pointed out last evening, some say it increases with complexity. Bigger brains have higher consciousness, so to speak, more folds in the gray matter. Well, what is mind? Joseph Bracken says that mind may be the realm where the synthesizing of this activity occurs. So, according to Bracken, there is actually a slight distinction between consciousness and mind. Consciousness as the flow of information, so to speak, mind as the field of information. However we conceive of these terms and their relationships, what we are saying is that what accounts for the human mind is active in the universe. And again, I take this as something that quantum physics begins to open up the door to this idea, and therefore the notion that, mind is emerging from matter, as if there's only matter that, over time can give rise to mind, I find a little bit problematic. Both Phil and Steve did point to some of these different philosophies of mind. Physicalism, the fact that mind could be, in a sense, all physical, all the way down, and just, emerging out of matter. Dualism in terms of mind and matter. We spent this morning talking about Panpsychism, and I was really intrigued by Steve's discussion on Panpsychism, that all mind is matter, or matter is becoming mind, and mind is a form of matter. A fourth aspect here is what some call dual aspect monism, where the mental and the material are different aspects or attributes of a unitary reality. So dual aspect monism takes sort of a metaphysical understanding of mind and matter as sort of complementary aspects of a unified reality, but that unified reality is grounded in something other than itself. So part of our own leanings into this conference really came from an article by Galen Strawson called The Hard Problem of Matter, or The Hard Problem of Consciousness. And in that article, he quotes Bertrand Russell on the hard problem of matter. Russell states, "We know nothing about the intrinsic quality of physical events, except when these are mental events that we directly experience." Here's the key. In having conscious experience, we learn something about the intrinsic nature of physical itself. For conscious experience is itself a form of physical stuff. Now that is very interesting. Conscious experience is itself a form of physical stuff. So it's kind of along those lines. I want to kind of move, as we've mentioned now, panpsychism and dualistic monism. And I just want to include here David Bohm's idea of implicate order. Bohm was a physicist, contemporary of Einstein, who saw things a little bit different. Bohm's idea is that the quantum world is entangled, that what we call reality is this kind of non-local entanglement in which there, what he called an implicate order and an explicate order. The implicate order is, in a sense, a way of looking at reality, not just in terms of its external interactions and things, but its internal relationships. And the explicate order is sort of the empirical level, right? In a sense, that level of where we're observing and, you might say, and distinguishing things. And someone once described Bohm's ideas like if you take a piece of paper and you fold it up and then you punch holes in the paper, if you unfold it, those holes are throughout the whole of the paper. So the implicate order is in the explicate order, so to speak. And what Bohm said is there's like an active bridge of information. And what he was trying to do, really, is trying to understand this relationship between reality, what we can empirically know, what we can experience, and consciousness. So, in his view, there is a level of subtlety, he says, between the mental pole and the physical pole. He says, but the deeper reality is something beyond either mind or matter. That's the key here. A deeper reality beyond mind or matter, both of which, he says, are only aspects that serve as terms for analysis. So what is he getting at here? Is there a metaphysical basis for mind and matter? I do find some of the problems with panpsychism, if you don't mind, and they have been raised, I'll just kind of reiterate them here. First of all, this relationship between the brain and conscious experience, I think at least one or two of our speakers have mentioned this already, right? So neurons fire, synapses are formed, but how do these processes, which are measurable, how do they form a subjective aspect of experience? How can we explain this? And truthfully, neuroscience cannot explain it. I can tell you how a neuron fires, I can tell you its frequency of firing, I can tell you what synapse it's going to make, I cannot tell you why it should give rise to a subjective experience. Physics aims to describe the fundamental constituents of the universe, again, I think it was Tim or Steve who mentioned this, we can only describe the behavior of particles, right? We can't say what a particle is intrinsically. We have absolutely no, what is the matter of matter, so to speak, or the particle of the particle. Third, if consciousness emerges from billions of subatomic consciousnesses, right? If we take the panpsychism, it's all little minds, moving into big mind. What forms these connections? I know someone raised that was a question raised before. The combination problem. What draws minds together? And finally, if consciousness is the basis of everything that exists, including matter, then I think, it is raising the question, is matter a form of consciousness? Really? It seems, or, as Max Tegmark speculates, is consciousness a form of matter? He even gives a word, perceptronium, to it. Consciousness as a form of matter. I find it problematic a little bit because it's not, I think I want to give matter its own due matter. There's something about matter I don't want to convert to mind, and there's something about mind that's, really intrinsic to matter. And therefore, I don't know if these questions can be adequately addressed by science or philosophy alone. So, this will either help illuminate our understanding or it will confuse it. Here we go. I'm going to, in a sense, speculate on the contribution of mysticism to the hard problem of consciousness. namely that we can't get around consciousness, however we try, right? Mysticism, as Bernard McGinn describes it, is, you might say, that direct or immediate consciousness of the presence or absence of God. We can say that it involves beliefs and practices that undergird this consciousness or immediate or direct presence of God, or it can be simply the transcendence of self-other dichotomy towards a liberation of human consciousness as we find in the Asian religions. I want to begin with the Asian religions, and then I want to move towards Western Christianity in order to draw, I think, a better a way of highlighting why I think the incarnational view of Christianity contributes to a particular understanding of the mind-matter challenge before us. So let's begin with Vedantic Hinduism. Phil mentioned a little of this last night in his talk. Vedanta philosophy considers the mind as a subtle form of matter. Really interesting, where the body and its components are simply the grosser forms of mind. So consciousness is considered finer than mind matter and pervasive and omnipresent. The whole, in a sense, thrust of Vedanta Hinduism is such that truths are revealed by diving deep into the self. So it is a self-exploration of the truth of reality, so to speak. Siddhartha Krishna states that the ultimate purpose of Vedanta Hinduism is to make us aware, first, of the pristine consciousness itself. In other words, the primacy of consciousness as the root reality and hence divinity, and therefore the inherent oneness of that consciousness with all living beings. So Vedanta is the philosophy of the Vedas, the most ancient scriptures of India, and basically it's saying that nature is divine, that, you know, this is that kind of a pantheistic maybe type of spirituality here, where the divine manifests itself in the underlying reality of every present being. And again, as Phil mentioned last night, you know, this quest for true reality is the quest for, you know, the liberation of an isolated consciousness into the full being of consciousness itself. So the term Atman, right, the true self, is that which shines out, which is the light of consciousness within us, but you might say stifled or darkened by the ego or by those things which blind it. Brahman is that consciousness that brings forth, right, the consciousness that is divinity from which everything arises. And so the Vedantic quest is where, you might say, moving into that self, where the light of consciousness is shining within us, we can eventually come to that consciousness which everything shines forth. So, in other words, the quest for Atman to become Brahman. Yoga is that practice of, ancient practice, really, going back to Panpsychism Maharishi, where, again, way back then, you know, they were dealing with these questions, right? So these questions are not new of mind and matter. Pantanjali realized that the mind is a complex entity with many different planes. And therefore, there needs to be a type of practice which can begin help us focus on self and the ability to self-reflect. So yoga in its stages of discipline, very similar to what we find in Christianity, right? The need to ascetically discipline oneself to liberate the mind in relation to the material reality of body. So I won't go through all of these in particular, but as we go from yama, from truthfulness, to niyama, to cleanliness of body, to asana, to ability to sit straight, to dharana, to the concentration and focusing of the mind, to dhyana, to meditation of God on the higher self. So what's interesting here for me is precisely, it's the physical body and the training of the physical body that you might say liberates one or, moves one into this realm of deeper consciousness, to the sense where, consciousness becomes the all-pervading reality. Interestingly, in Vedantic Hinduism, their emphasis is on, this is an interesting saying, The Vedanta teaches men to have faith in themselves first. As certain religions of the world say that a man who does not believe in a personal God outside of himself is an atheist. So the Vedanta says a man who just does not believe in himself is an atheist. Not believing in the glory of our own soul is what the Vedanta calls atheism. Really interesting, you know, in terms of the value, you might say, or what is contained, as if the whole universe is contained in the single person. So interestingly here is that the individual consciousness is, in a sense, in perceptual error due to ignorance, due to, you might say, selfishness, due to the things of attachment by way of love or desire. And therefore, the individual consciousness gets entangled in the world by forgetting its true nature. So the Yoga Sutras are, in a sense, that path of liberation from this ephemeral world of existence through the cycles of birth and death and rebirth to that state of Purusha, right? That state of pure consciousness, that state where, in a sense, it's a trans-ego sense of consciousness. Well, what exactly is this? Because we never move beyond the body, right? We're always, in a sense, in body now in these higher levels of consciousness. What is exactly are we moving into? As the yoga moves to that higher level, they move to this level of samadhi, right? This sense of a unity of the subject and object, a consciousness of unity. So this notion of oneness is the sense that the mind, whatever we conceive as the mind, is still walking and sitting and staying, but it's a straightforward mind. It has no attachments whatsoever. So that's interesting in itself. To live in the world with a sense in a detached mind with an intentionality of, you might say, staying focused in these deep levels of consciousness, being in the world and involved in it, being with thoughts and at the same time, you might say, at the depths, living outside these depths of consciousness, even while within the world. World, consciousness, materiality, mind. And yet these things are unified in this discipline of moving into these levels of consciousness. Another scholar says to be aflame with silence, with joy is wisdom. It is not through logic, but through love. It is not through words, but through a mindless state called meditation or a state of mind, which is samadhi. So the Eastern, at least this Vedantic Hinduistic quest, moves to this level of consciousness that moves them into pure awareness of being in all things. In this sense, certainly from this perspective, mind and matter are illusions of a distinct reality. Reality is one. And that reality, from this perspective, is consciousness. So it's a really panpsychic view, right? It's all mental. It's all awareness. So pure consciousness here is true existence. Now, it's kind of interesting because I think the Vedantic Hindu does not get rid of materiality, and yet the true reality is not materiality. This, I think, is distinguished from the Christian perspective. So here I'm going to switch sides, and I want to explore the Christian God here in relation to the mystical quest, and then in relation to our question of mind and matter. I want to begin with several quotes that pertain to God as the personal ground. Thomas Merton wrote in his work, Zen and the Birds of Appetite, "If I penetrate to the depths of my own existence, to the indefinable am that is myself in its deepest roots, then through this deep center, I pass into the infinite I am, which is the very name of the Almighty." So that's a very interesting quote. That's not too far different from, you might say, Buddhism or the Vedantic Hindu, right? There's something about the human person that has this indefinable am, something in the core of our being that cannot be appropriated by science, right? That eludes the grasp of the physicist's mind or the biological tools. St. Augustine wrote in his Confessions, "But you were more inward than my own inwardness." You as a personal you, a consciousness of God or divinity at the heart of one's own being, materiality. Thomas Merton wrote, "At the center of our being is a point of pure nothingness which belongs entirely to God." So we're not talking here about some kind of, just kind of a field of mind. We're talking here now about something that is deeply personal, deeply subjective, and experienced at the heart and the core of one's being. The psalmist writes, "God, you search me, and you know me." So again, that experience of withinness that eludes any measurability, of being known and being sought after. And then, of course, we have Simone Weil's wonderful insight: whoever says "I" lies. That there is no individual, autonomous, isolated, self-isolated thing called I. That whatever it is that constitutes the person as, a self-thinking subject has an other at the heart of it. The Sufi mystic Mansour Halaj in the 10th century said, "I saw my Lord with the eye of my heart, and I said, 'Who are you?' And he said, 'Yourself.'" So what's really interesting in the various mystics here is that they're perceiving something. They're conscious of something at the heart of their own lives. It's something that cannot be, again, grasped, but it is known deep within. And what's interesting is that these are across traditions, so we can't say that there's any bias, so to speak, in terms of a religious tradition. I'm going to then maybe move to the more Christian perspective, and then what is this that we're perceiving? We give because it's a personal divinity, right? It's not a field of divinity, it's not a background of divine, it's not something hovering over us, it's a personal thou, a personal you. And therefore I think the name God here is appropriate. God as that personal ground of being. I do like Paul Tillich's notion of God when he says, "There lies beneath the surface an infinite and inexhaustible dimension of depth. Core mystery," he says, "the dimension of inexhaustibility, a depth dimension that overflows with meaning, the excess of all phenomena." He says it is the experienced ultimacy of being and meaning. It is the realm of ultimate concern. And the name of this infinite and inexhaustible depth is God. And here, I think when we use the language of God as the inexhaustible depth, that ultimate meaning, we are, in a sense, in Anselm's ontological argument. God is that than which no greater can be known, than which no greater can be thought. The human mind does reach, you might say, a limit. And God, therefore, surpasses and transcends that limit as God. But what is God? And so that's, it's a question that I have. I continue to ask myself. I ask my students, so what is God? Because, we use the language of being, or we use the language of highest being. But, Scripture, if we go back to Exodus, we read in Genesis that God is revealed as I am, right? Being, existence. If we take that as our starting point, therefore, understanding what the name God points to in its utter mystery, we can then rely on Aristotle's notion of being as eternal motion. That motion or movement is actually prior to anything that exists. That entities come into existence and cease to be, but motion endures forever, right? Everything is in movement. Now, I like this idea because, first of all, it's consonant, in a sense, with our own understanding of reality, but here we're saying if being is an activity, if what it means to exist is to, in a sense, not just simply be, but to always, in a sense, becoming, right? Then being itself is a never-ending conversion from potentiality into actuality, right? It's a never-ending conversion from what is not to what is, or possibly is to what is. And therefore, the active being is an eternal movement from potentiality to act. That means that the infinity of being is dynamic and creative. Now that's really interesting in itself, right? There is, in a sense, no such thing as existence, as that existence is always existing. It is always, in a sense, coming into its own beingness. So the name God, therefore, points to that unlimited horizon of dynamic being, always in act as subsistent activity, not just a fixed reality. And therefore, God is in continuous passage from potency to act. Putting this another way, God is always becoming God. And that may sound, like, what? But stick with the program. In other words, there's a principle of dynamism here, where the very notion of being itself is always an eternal movement of ever ongoing creativity. And therefore, we can say that creativity finds in God, in the name God, its primordial embodiment. And it's God, therefore, who gives it its primordial characterization. In this respect, we can speak of God as the absolute horizon of creativity in self-creation or self-determination. And that creativity in self-determination is that God is both self-aware and self-loving. The name God points to that absolute, in a sense, knowledge and love, consciousness and love. Here I look to someone like Augustine, for whom God is memory, intellect, will. Right? In the sense that to know, in that absolute ongoing creativity of knowing or consciousness, is in a sense to love. So the ground of being, and this is really what I want to get to, the ground of being, that which is, apart from science, before we get to science, the ground of being itself is creativity, which is itself a dynamic movement of consciousness and love. Now, the Christian, from Christian revelation, John 4:13 tells us God is love. That is what God is, love. And therefore, in this sense, the ground of being is self-creating love. So intense and personal that it expresses itself as Trinity. So Trinity now is not just a God as, you might say, a monad God, or just a self-thinking God. Trinity is now disclosing something to us. It symbolizes to us something about God, and that is God is intensely personal, God is intensely self-communicative, and therefore God is a dynamism of intersubjectivity, a communion of being in love. So this notion, therefore, of Trinity, a communion of persons in love, as the ground of a dynamic being in creativity, means that there's something about love that itself is not stable. Love is always not just interpersonal, but it's interpersonal in a way that there's always a creative dynamic between two persons, right? There's always a third, a medium of openness, by which those two persons are always open to something becoming something more than they are as persons. And therefore, if we can take this notion of Trinity in relation to the notion of being as creativity, as a ground of what is, I think it opens the doors anyway to maybe a new understanding of what we call matter. Here I'm looking at, again, using Augustine's notion of memory, intellect, and will, but taking those three, you might say, dynamics of an interpersonal God and saying that at the heart of an interpersonal God is the outward, it might say, impelled sharing of that love with an other, which we name as creation. In other words, if we ask, well, why does God create? I know Tim mentioned, out of free will, and I'm going to argue God is creative precisely because God is love. And that love is ever self-knowing. The highest love, in a sense, is that knowing in love, right? It's always a sense of a conscious being in love. And so we call this shared life of God, this outflow of love. And if I can just say this for a moment, we talk a lot about consciousness. It's interesting that even in terms of science, we're getting a little bit attuned to talking about mind in relation to matter. But when it comes to love, we automatically, a scientist would automatically go, oh, really? Seriously? Love? And I'm going to introduce love here as maybe the missing ingredient to this conversation. And so, how are we going to do that? I'm going to do it through what is the cornerstone of the Christian tradition, and that is incarnation. Incarnation, the Word becoming flesh, right? God entering into. There's something about God that cannot remain as God. There's something about God that has to be self-gifting, self-giving, and it's the very nature of God, not simply as dynamic creativity, but there's something about God in terms of being persons in love that must share that love. Is that a necessity in terms of God? I think wherever there's love, there's a freedom, so I think there's a built-in dialectic into God in terms of necessity and freedom. In any event, what we are saying is that the uncreated Word, uncreated love, that which you might say is the ground of everything, so to speak, as that which no greater can be loved, is consciously becoming matter, conscious matter, incarnation. What's interesting, however, is the particularity of love. So there is something in all our discussions, it always comes back to the ontology of the singular. You can never even talk about consciousness in some kind of, broad, categorical way. It does come down to I observe, I measure, I love. Is this a kind of like a new kind of, it's all about me, Cartesian type of situation? I don't think so. I think we're talking here of type of existence where there's a particular character to the conscious being of existence itself. The prophet Jeremiah says, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. So in a sense, our own existence is in a sense an existence that is already embedded in a being known. Not just that we are the knowers, we are in a sense already known in our existence. And in that being known, we are already loved into our existence. And this is where I think, the Christian mystics really come into play. Many of, especially if you go back, here I'm going to focus a little bit on a medieval mystic by the name of Angela of Foligno. I know my Franciscan sisters here will know her well. In the letter to the Colossians, we read, I have died, and my life now is hidden with Christ in God. Again, this is not too different from the Vedantic Hindu, who's saying that my true self, what I really am, is not in myself, but it is in the ground of my being, which is God, or for the Hindu, in that pure consciousness of divinity. That gets sort of turned around, and here's what's interesting about the Christian incarnation. It turns, in a sense, what the Eastern religions, in a sense, aspire to, it turns it upside down. Consciousness, in a sense, is not what we are moving toward. Rather, consciousness, in a sense, is what we become in our flesh. So I look at Angela Foligno. Angela Foligno was a late 12th, 13th century Franciscan penitent. She was uneducated. She had a very interesting beginning. You might appreciate this. She had this, as a Franciscan, she had a great devotion to Francis of Assisi and the crucified Christ, which was a big devotion in the 13th century. But she felt that her husband and sons were in the way of her spiritual life. And therefore, she prayed that they would die. And sure enough, they were dead within 2 years. Yep, that's how powerful we're talking about here. She is unlettered, was never trained in reading or writing, and yet she is known as the teacher of theologians. Her profound insights and mystical insights were very influential on Teresa of Avila. To kind of get to the main part of the story, she begins to live this ascetic life, right? She, in a sense, like the Hindu, right? She begins a bodily asceticism, fasting, long periods of prayer, works of charity, intense focus on the crucified Christ, intense long hours of looking at this cross. Now, what's interesting here is you have to take into account the materiality of the incarnation here. So, from the Franciscan perspective, it's not that we go to God, it's that God has become to us. So it's this incarnational, that what is the ground of our being is now in the flesh. And it's the flesh, therefore, that becomes paramount to, in a sense, this path to higher levels of consciousness. At one point, Angela writes in her instructions, a series, well, she doesn't write it, one of her disciples does, a series of stages of how she comes to this more intense awareness of God present in the suffering of the crucified Christ. At one point, she no longer experiences the events of the cross as an onlooker. Here's the key. But as if she were reenacting the passion in the inmost parts of her being, from within the events themselves. So she's not getting beyond material world. Now she is entering into precisely the historical event reenacted in her imagination of the crucified one. In a vision, she had a number of visions, right? So she comes to these deeper levels of consciousness where she has a vision now of being ever the more drawn intimately into the life of the crucified Christ. Now, this passage is really interesting. Wrapped in spirit, Paul Lachance writes, she found herself in the sepulchre together with Christ. Eyes closed, lying there dead, a most wonderful and indescribable odor emanated from his mouth as she kissed it. She then placed her cheek against Christ's own, and he in turn placed his hand against her other cheek and pressed her closely to him. Well, she did get rid of her husband, so that could explain that. What's so interesting here is the intense physicality of a vision that's taking place at higher levels of consciousness. And here is an icon. Actually, it's a Francis of Assisi embracing the crucified. But it's this, the mystery here, in a sense, is of matter itself. In a sense that matter is becoming porous to deeper levels of mind. We can say, in a sense, Angela's asceticism not only subdues the flesh, clearly it's precisely her ascetical practices that enable her to enter into this mystery of the crucified Christ that liberates her mind. But in a sense, it's her fleshy mind, you might say, that's liberated. The mind actually becomes flesh. The mind becomes porous, and therefore it becomes a kind of conscious being in love. So she doesn't transcend the physical. Rather, the physical becomes, you might say, translucent consciousness. God becomes now ever the more visible and tangible in the flesh. And therefore, she's drawn to this level of ecstatic love whereby self and God are unified. She comes to a level of intense union with God. in this kind of physical relationship where she finds herself in darkness. So consciousness shining through matter is drawn by love into this object of desire, namely the crucified Christ, in which God, she encounters God. And this is both other than herself, and herself is other. And that's what's interesting. As she begins to, in a sense, move into this unified state of being in love, herself now is taken out of herself and is precisely now in God, and God is in her, and yet it becomes more, in a sense, her truest self, not unlike the Hindu. So, again, Lachance writes, Angela was so certain of God's presence that she spoke of having attained, on one hand, a true knowledge of self, and on the other, a true knowledge of the overwhelming kindness of God. Here's a picture. This is not Angela, this is another mystic, but this, in a sense, this kind of rapture, this kind of enlightened flesh that comes from a deep being of mind in God. At one point, she comes to this level of mystical darkness where, in a sense, her center of gravity now is no longer in herself, but in God. And she says, I see all, and I see nothing. So this now, I think, becomes ever the more interesting because she's experiencing in this brilliant darkness this kind of mystical presence of, she's in God's life. And that's what's interesting. She's in God's life in the flesh. She's experiencing a sense of pure consciousness and intense love where she finds herself, in a sense, lying in the midst of the Trinity. Now that's, it can't be resolved, right? It cannot be reduced to, neurons moving around, or, we're talking about informational flow between particles. There's something here that goes beyond anything that we've talked about so far. Here I look to Merleau-Ponty, who says, we perceive our flesh not as something separate, but as the perceiver itself, a self-perceived perceiver. Matter as a consciousness, a porousness to, in a sense, opening up of mind. Ponty says, to become fully receptive to experience as it is, with its undifferentiated, unbounded, massive, opaque style appearing, even the flesh to this precise body fades. That's really interesting. The flesh fades, and yet it never becomes other than flesh. So he says the whole surrounding world is then perceived as an extension of my flesh, and then becomes the flesh of the world as flesh. So what are we talking about here? What is mind here? What is matter here? It's no longer clear about what is being, and yet the mystic is perceiving something very real, very, in a sense, tangible, in a sense that it's sensual. The senses are really perceiving something. Angela had a number of mystical experiences where she saw herself, or felt, actually, being given, or fed, you might say, the Eucharist in a mystical vision. And it's symbolic, again, of materiality, right? It's symbolic of a materiality that's imbued with divinity. So she writes after one vision, she says, in a vision, I beheld the fullness of God in which I comprehended the whole creation. She says, that is what is on this side, what is beyond the sea, the abyss, the sea itself, and everything else. And in everything that I saw, I could perceive nothing except the presence of the power of God, and in a manner totally indescribable. She said her soul cried out, the world is pregnant with God. In a sense, I don't find this too different from the Vedantic Hindu in their perception of samadhi. Right? I find it very similar. And Angela says, wherefore I understood how small is the whole of creation, that what's on this side and what is beyond the sea, the abyss, the sea itself, and everything else, the power of God fills it to overflowing. What is it that is filling it to overflowing? What is this power of God? So, I find something very similar in the poem by Marina Rilke, The Outer Space Within. Through every being, Rilke writes, single space extends, outer space within. Through us, the birds fly silently. O I who grow, I look outside, and in me grows the tree. Matter and mind, no longer, in a sense, distinguished. Now we have a flow, in a sense, of a oneness here. I want to, in a sense, highlight that this level of consciousness here, this mystical consciousness, is an emotional consciousness, besides being a mindful consciousness. We haven't mentioned the levels, the role of the emotions in mind, and yet what we see in Angela, certainly, is a movement through levels of consciousness that evolve at the higher levels in erotic love, in ecstatic love. Many of the mystics talk of love in terms of madness, in terms of infinite longing, annihilation, so that the senses between the inner and outer no longer are distinguished. Kind of this insanity of love is mixed with their ascetical practices. So Bernie McGinn says this infinite longing reveals that the soul is in some way sort of infinite itself, what we call the soul. What is it that's grounding us? What is it that's the us of us, right? In a sense, this, through this ascetical experience, the annihilation of the created will leaves nothing present but God, or the no thing, or the no self. In a sense, the self that enters into God becomes no self but self in God. So that self-identity and identity with God becomes one without becoming pantheistic, right? Do I become God? Absolutely not. Angela clearly did not say, I become God, and yet she found herself lying deep in the embrace of the Trinity. And so all of this is taking place through the body, this intimate, intangible love of God. And that's, to me, an incredible mystery. Bernadette Roberts, and I think for the sake of time I might not read this whole thing here. But again, this is a modern mystic. Bernadette Roberts died last year, I think in 2017. In her book, The Path to No Self. Very similar to Angela Foligno, saying that the true nature of the self can only be fully disclosed when it is gone. And she says, when there's no self. And she says, the self is the entire system of consciousness, from the unconsciousness to God consciousness, the entire dimension of human knowing and feeling experiencing. She says, because the terms self and consciousness express the same experiences, they are definable in terms of experience. They are defined in terms of experience. And therefore, she says, no self, therefore, means no consciousness. And therefore, she says, once we come to the state of oneness, we can go no further in the inward journey. She goes on to say, and that I think is it, right? We do reach the limits. Even in the mystical quest, we reach the limits of which we can go no further. In Bernadette's view, we come to that divine center, so to speak, that innermost point. And once we reach there, everything breaks down. In a sense, that is the darkness. That's the death. The divine, in a sense, then takes over and breaks through, she says, shattering the ego like an arrow shot through the center of being. And this breakthrough, in a sense, meeting the divine in this limit of the human mind, then is the breakthrough through a new level of consciousness. So where does that kind of leave us? On one hand, mystical consciousness has this somatic character, right? Mystical consciousness is not leaving matter behind, it's actually entering into the very depths of matter itself. And yet the mystical subject is shown as less limited and less bound to this created nature. And part of the breakdown is this, it's not just about mind. And in other words, there's a direction to mind itself, and that direction to consciousness is love. Love, therefore, becomes, in a sense, the direction of mind towards, in a sense, that fullness of being, this madness of love that breaks down the boundaries of consciousness and self. So love deepens consciousness. I mean, that's what the mystics are telling us over and over, right? How do you come to higher levels of consciousness? You don't will them, like, there's something that's drawing, right? There's something that's pulling onwards, and that is love. So that in the highest levels of love, there's an allness and nothing. Darkness and light are inseparable. The dissolution of self and the true self are one. I call this the cosmotheandric self. And I think, part of, as I reflect this morning, which I really, really appreciate our various perspectives here, I find the word naturalistic too limiting. It's too restrictive. It's missing out on the depth dimension of matter itself. That dimension that you might say that as the mystics move into that depth dimension, they then encounter this root dimension of reality that we name as God. What I do find in their journeys is that as they move into this depth dimension of God, that even space-time takes on different characteristics, right? The arrow of time collapses for the mystic. Space becomes this fullness of infinite fullness of love. This unitive allness that is experienced, this unity with nature. So in these last few minutes, I want to kind of bring this back now into a bigger paradigm of, you might say, the material universe we find ourselves in. Here I'm going to look to Carl Jung, who had a really interesting, I think, view on consciousness and God. In Jung's view, God is that unconscious or the collective unconscious. Now, it's kind of I find it interesting. I don't know if I buy it entirely, but I find it really interesting. Because he's saying that God is that ground, so to speak, that hidden darkness. And for Jung, I should say, not Jung, consciousness, the whole movement of consciousness is a movement of unconsciousness into this kind of self-transforming process of individuating and becoming whole. In his view, it's God. So consciousness is not becoming a self, true self. It's actually God becoming truly God, if I can put it this way. Jung, in a sense, turns things around from what we've been talking about. In his view, incarnation, this self-emptying of God, is God becoming consciousness and completed by humankind in directed evolution. In a sense, he says God needs humankind to be both whole and complete. And therefore, in his view, I'll just focus on the third point, God and humanity, he says, are in an entangled state. Well, that's an interesting idea. Right? In other words, we can't really extrapolate one from the other. Because even in our own experience, whether you're talking from a scientific perspective or a mystical perspective, that we come to a limit where we can't just get out of that depth dimension of what it is. So he says the individuation of each is inextricably bound with the other. In other words, the evolution of God and the evolution of humanity cannot be separated. So Christ crucified in this way becomes, in a sense, the symbol of a union of opposites. That it's precisely this death on the cross that, you might say, shatters the ego, and it's through death, in a sense, that one breaks through into this fullness of love, which is a creative newness in love and a created freedom. I think this is what I find in Angela Foligno. This death of the self, this death of the ego is, in a sense, then the liberation of what we truly are, by which when we become truly are, God then becomes truly one in us. So I think for the sake of time, I'm just going to move here. Yeah. Who brings us together? Who else but my friend and guide to the universe, Teilhard de Chardin. Teilhard, I think, well, first of all, he was a scientist. He was a paleontologist. He, observed very closely the natural things of biology, but he was also a mystic. He was a Jesuit. I think he had a mystical insight into the matter of matter, so to speak. And I think with Teilhard we see that science, philosophy, and religion must be brought together if we are to make sense of the whole of our experience, which is the key here. And so I think Teilhard does hold out to us a type of what I might call a dual aspect monism. In his view, everything that exists has, you might say, what he called a withinness, a level of consciousness, and a withoutness. He says a level of attraction. And so Teilhard holds together this withinness, this radial energy, consciousness as transcendence, with the withoutness, and that is this tangential energy of attraction. I mean, I was even listening before this morning, you know, like why do the particles move together, so to speak? You know, that's always our question. Why this particle move to this particle, right? And we can give some scientific explanation, but really that's just a descriptive answer. In Teilhard's view, it's God Omega, and here he comes back to very much like Jung. In fact, John Gurley did studies on Teilhard and Carl Jung, precisely on this notion, that God Omega is, in a sense, that ground, right, that metaphysical ground of conscious being in love. And yet, this ground that's at the heart of everything is at the same time becoming everything. The ground that's at the heart of everything is at the same time being incarnated in everything, precisely through consciousness and love. And so Teilhard sees this movement of evolution as the rise of consciousness and love. We have only had the discussion on consciousness, and what Teilhard adds to that from an incarnational perspective is then the energy of love. And he often says, we don't know what love is. I mean, we have the experience of love, but he says that is the most unknown energy, you know, in the universe. And therefore, this movement towards ever-increasing levels of consciousness and love is omega-driven, and yet at the same time, it's God becoming God, right? Omega rising up in consciousness. So in a sense, we are giving consciousness to that which, in a sense, empowers us in consciousness. God becoming God, so to speak. So this kind of dual aspect monism, or cosmotheandric holism, and maybe that's the word I would like to give to it all here. Cosmotheandric holism. I think naturalism for me is too restrictive. Emergent dualism, again, too defining and restrictive, in a sense, too categorizing. There's something about the whole that's becoming ever the more whole, whether it's the whole of a particle, or the whole of a cell, or the whole of an amoeba, or the whole of a person. I'll just maybe read the last line here. God is creativity, and the eternal act of creativity is grounded in self-knowing, self-giving love. Then consciousness and love are constantly forming the world into existence. The sheer act of existence means being drawn beyond the limits of consciousness into the infinite horizon of consciousness. And that infinite horizon of consciousness is the boundless love of God. Moving into that boundless love of God, then, is the very incarnation of God. So, in Teilhard's view, consciousness, he says, in a sense, is what is, you know, at the heart of evolution. He says, but what makes matter matter? What brings matter together, he says, is love. And again, I mean, you know, I was a scientist and I was with my Rutgers colleagues a few weeks ago, and if I were to tell them that the physical structure is love, they would say to me, really, you know, you really need to change your medication, you know, right? Because it's we kind of back off from the realm of the emotions in the very materiality of matter itself. The materiality of matter itself is not matter, you know. It's not matter, it's love. And that love is always a form of consciousness, right? You cannot love what you do not know. And yet consciousness itself is always a transcendence, an experience of otherness, and therefore it's always love. And so Teilhard says at the end of the day, something is happening to the whole structure of human consciousness. Yay, Teilhard. A fresh kind of life is starting. Driven by the forces of love, he says, the fragments of the world are seeking each other so that the world may come into being. The end. Thanks. Yes, please. Phil.
So that's fascinating. I think if we can understand the union part, we can understand this movement back out again. And I'm struggling to do it. So may I ask you the question the way the Hindu tradition would ask you, and see how you would answer?
Yeah.
In the Hindu tradition, there are these two possibilities. The names are Shankara and Ramanuja.
Yeah.
And the one is that all becomes absolutely one, so the individual ceases to exist as separate, pantheism, and all that exists is Sat Chit Ananda, being, consciousness, bliss. On the other side, Ramanuja, it's called the Bhakti tradition, which is worship, and you rise up these stages till the fourth stage, and the next step is union with God, and the mystic stops and says, I'd much rather remain with enough separateness to be me so that I can eternally worship thee.
Ah, yes.
And in some times you seem to move into the full union, and sometimes you seem to keep some distinction.
I do,
So I can't tell if you're a mystical pantheist or a mystical pantheist.
Yeah, thanks.
The Hindus would
Struggling
be
with it myself. Actually, I think from this perspective, Phil, I think what we're talking about here is almost just the opposite, if I can say this. I find the trajectory of incarnation a reverse precisely of what you're describing for the Hindu. That instead of moving into this, and that's interesting about the worship, always remaining in a sense, so that one can always move toward, so we're moving toward. Here, in a sense, what I think, if I can just put this in another framework, I find that very Plotinian, in a sense of moving towards the one. And I think what Christianity does in a certain way, it kind of reverts Plotinus, so that the one now is in the many. So that this movement into that fullness of one is precisely in the incarnation of the many, the distinction of subjectivity, the distinction of personhood. So that what we're moving towards is not a homogeneous unit. And I don't even think this is what the Hindus want in terms of this oneness, but that's the image I get of this kind of uniform oneness. And what I find here in incarnational spirituality is the rich diversity of the particular subject. And what I like about it is because it holds the value of the particular. This person, this leaf, has the infinite value of, eternal love.
I wondering how you factor in the reality of prayer as an articulation of its transcendence into the experience of God as my brother. That would be one question. The second one is, you speak of the cornerstone of Christianity as being incarnation. Wasn't resurrection?
Oh, yes, sure.
So I would like you to
Yeah, sure. Right. So, two things. One, I think prayer, thank you for, I just, in a sense, did not add that, but it's implicit, certainly, in the journey of the mystics, right? That prayer is that deep dialogue, that deep relationship, right? That being with the other, namely God. And so as prayer deepens into that wordless being in God, prayer is essential. So prayer is absolutely essential to this. Incarnation is foundational. I take then incarnation as culminating in resurrection. So, in fact, all that I'm talking about here, as I see it through Teilhard, is all about resurrection life. So, when I say the whole universe is God becoming God, incarnating God, it is, in a sense, that resurrection, new creativity, and new life is, in a sense, the very future orientation of the universe itself. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Good. Yes?
Hope you can hear me.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so very much. And finally, understood everything. You were speaking my language, okay. And two things. First of all, as a Muslim, I probably you're familiar with these two lines. God saying, I'm the great mystery. I wanted to know myself, so I created.
Yes.
So, everything-
Beautiful. Yes.
Everything you said.
That's exact. Yeah.
From transparency to translucent to opaque, and then going backward. And the other one, which goes just opposite way, to know me, know thyself to know me.
Yes.
And and I thank you because again, I can never kind of articulate as you are. But the very fact that as a Muslim, I'm always trying to understand Trinity because I believe in the beauty of embracing the tradition, which I see you do too. Thank you.
Yeah.
And so you explained to me the Trinity as I understood it as a Muslim, and thank you for that.
Oh, good. Yeah. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Great.
I appreciate yours.
Thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to comment on Phil's comment on unity and unitiveness. In the metaphor of lovers, it feels to me, and this will be a funny thing too, so Jesus ends his ministry by calling his disciples friends.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember thinking about love and just feeling like there was this prompting to say, don't forget phileo. Phileo is how the world's going to change. And I think that's because phileo is the unifying love, where we become God's children in a way that we are so aligned with God that together we are co-creating
Yeah.
this universe.
Yes.
And so I guess I wanted to say to that comment, to me I don't like those choices. To me, it feels more like in a marriage where you come together and you're one and you lose each other, right? And both of you are devoted to each other. I think God is devoted to us as we are devoted to God. And then I think you leave, in a sense, the bedroom and go out into the world together as partners now, and to let, as you said somewhere in the beginning, that co-creating love, or that moving deep within yourself to find that you are indeed created by God to become like God so that you can work with God. And then coming out of that divine awareness to bring love as part of the unitive body of God until all are part of that unity in God. And each has their own voice because God desires that it's a multitude.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean,
Sorry about that.
Yeah. I mean, the term Christ, really does point to that, that love incarnate, right? In a sense, we say that we are the body of Christ. And that's, in a sense, what we're talking about as we move through prayer into deeper levels of consciousness, awareness, as we enter into this mystery of divinity at the heart of our lives. That mystery of divinity now rises up in consciousness in our own lives. And in a sense, that's what we're saying. It incarnates itself, right? That word becomes flesh. Now, our flesh. We become then that conscious presence and love of God in the world. In a sense, and that's why I think the whole metaphor of, the use of love here, in a sense that where there is a conscious being in love, there is true differentiation. That we're not trying to, in a sense, make everything into like us. Precisely the opposite. It's precisely the value of the particularity of existence that makes the richness of God ever the more present in the unity of love.
And when you talk about the potentiality, it feels to me like there are so many ways of being in love and being love and acting out of love, that in that sense, the woman who just commented is that God needs a multitude to pour out all the potentialities that God saw in the many ways that love could be incarnated.
Right, and that love is a knowing love. So I guess what I want to really highlight here is the integral relationship between consciousness and love. Only consciousness, only mind without love, I think, in a sense, it can't find its way, its fullness of what its meaning. Yeah, in relation to matter. Yeah.
So thank you very much for your writings and for this conference. I must say a lot of it, I think, is a deep dive for me, and it's over my head. But a bit of what I've picked up along the way is that Teilhardian notion that at the heart of it all is love, let loose. And I've connected that with E equal MC squared. So science with that theology, that the Big Bang is the beginning, if you will, of incarnation. That creation, what we would call the creation, the Big Bang, the beginning of this universe, at least by our measurement, is the release of love. And it continues on. And so the incarnation, in a sense, started with that, or maybe far deeper than that, but it continues to go on.
Right.
Am I too because I see that brings together a sort of theology and a astronomical sense of history and science.
Yes, I mean, whether or not the Big Bang is the start of this universe, what we are saying is that creation is ex amore, right? Creation out of love, right? In a sense, that's what, the nature of love is to give itself away. In a sense, creation is a finite expression, you might say, of the infinite love of God. However that began, or if it ever began. Might have been always. I think, are we out of time? Huh? We have to wrap it up. Oh, do you have a quick question?
I can keep it quick, short. Maybe a bit different from where we was coming from regarding philosophy, but something that struck me from your presentation was the experience that St. Angela had within the Franciscan tradition. Bonaventure also experienced essentially a mystical experience based on Francis' mystical experience, Shabbat vision. Now, a number of them, particularly Bonaventure as well as Teilhard, have commented on this seraphic order of humanity that will come in the future.
Oh, right,
Calls
yeah.
it the ultra-human. So just curious, did Angela comment on that at all?
She did not. That's a really interesting question. Can we hold that to the panel?
Sure.
Maybe we can
And
come back to that.
Maybe a question for you, sharing that spiritual heritage. What do those shared mystical experiences, particularly within that Franciscan strain, what does that mean for you? Theologian, scientist, how do you bring that together?
Okay. I'm going to hold those questions. I'm going to come back to them this afternoon after the panel. Okay, thanks. Thank you.